Let me begin by saying, looking at this audience, some of you are over 60, a few. This is not the weed you smoked in college. This is much more potent. As a friend of mine tried using some of the edibles that we had that came out, and he was watching a football game on Friday. He woke up Sunday, the Broncos were three quarters of the game was already over. And we had to remind him that this is not the same kind of weed that he smoked in college, because he said that he was young, he was active, and that he knew what was, he was a hip guy, so that he could handle it. Well, he found out he couldn't handle it. It was much more difficult. Point that I'd like to share with you is you are not Canada. Canada's a lot more homogeneous in population. Now, this is basically a national battle going on. You just happen to be the latest battlefield. It's going on all across the country. Massachusetts was one that where it passed. I worked on the campaign in Arizona. It failed. This was passed in 2012. I was not mayor at that particular point in time. I was mayor of Denver from 1991 to 2003. But let me outline the issues kind of as I see them. The first issue is social justice. People will say and share with you that we need to do something with the social justice issue. Too many minorities have picked up on drug charges. And if we decriminalize marijuana, then that would also decriminalize the marijuana charges against minority youth in particular. First of all, this is a white industry. Let that sink in for a minute. This is a white industry. You go across the country, you don't see any minority growers, and you see very few minority dispensaries. But what you do see is minority dispensaries in minority neighborhoods that are owned by non-minorities. And when you look at where the money's going, it is not going into minority neighborhoods. You do not need to pass legislation to legalize marijuana if the goal is to decriminalize sentencing that is disparate as present for minority youth, black and brown in particular. Illicit drugs will not go away. Drugs that are being sold in neighborhoods and low-income neighborhoods are still going to be there. In Denver, those neighborhoods, many of the street dealers that thought they were going to be put out of business found out that they weren't, because the prices that they were selling drugs for was much lower than what was being sold for in dispensaries that have to go through regulation. In Colorado, as an example, if you sold $800 worth of marijuana, that $800 worth of street value in New York is $3,600. So we have many cartels now in Colorado, primarily in Pueblo County and others, that are growing marijuana primarily to dispense it in other parts of the country. Marijuana today is much more potent, and the edibles, the candies, the cookies are also a problem with young kids and parents. Parents often will leave the cookies, the edibles around. I don't know if this is addressed in your legislation, but Dr. Thurston, who is a research physician at Denver Health, your local clinical physicians might want to talk to him. He's done extensive studies in terms of what the aspects of marijuana is taking place on young kids, mothers, and especially young kids that are getting hold of marijuana before they what normally happens is they use it, they get high, and then they leave it on the coffee table. Or they leave it next to the shoes in front of the couch while they're watching the football game. This is a new industry with the same traits as tobacco. Alcohol consumption is still level for 18 to 24-year-olds. Consumption continues to increase for even younger ages. We know that medical science impacts that have been studied also have impact on brain development for younger kids and teenagers. Dr. Thurston's evidence suggests that increase in school suspensions and expulsions take place more for those impacted and affected with marijuana. Now, I think business communities across the country have more than one challenge about promoting business. I think it's also important to provide some moral leadership as well, and not take for granted that these things are automatically going to pass because they're on the ballot and they're popular. I've even got tricked a little bit by one of my own kids, and I'll speak to that last. Drug felony cases, article that was done by the Denver Post, Josh Osher. Drug felony cases doubled in 6 years in Colorado. Colorado prosecutors filed more than 15,000 felony drug cases in 2017, twice as many as they did in 2012, mostly for possession, and most of that were women and minorities. Now, I would suggest that the Michigan legislature needs to decriminalize and do something with sentencing before even addressing the aspect of this ballot issue. The other issue I've shared with some minority chambers is, if you're supporting this, is this good for you? Is this good for business? If you accept the fact that you discount the health issues, you don't believe the science, you take the attitude it's going to happen anyway, has a state done a disparity study to allow you to go into business, to open up a marijuana franchise? I would suspect not. So if it does pass, are you prepared to answer these types of questions? Is this regulation properly funded at the state and local level for regulation and for enforcement? Are you prepared to rule on pot licenses, pot clubs, areas of public consumption, location for dispensaries, or all of them going to be as they normally are in minority neighborhoods? Are you going to expand treatment and prevention services, especially for 18 to 24-year-olds? Are you prepared to increase the size of your local police department? In Denver, we have a new police chief. He said for his section dealing with narcotics, they increased from 1 sergeant and 3 detectives, which they formerly had, to 3 sergeants and 12 detectives for Denver only. Are your firefighters and fire departments prepared to deal with this issue if it passes? Why would fire departments be involved? Because if police go to a particular site where growing is taking place either in the house or in the backyard, the growing of plants in backyards, sometimes there's flammable material, sometimes there's mold, sometimes there are other issues that are more fire department oriented than police department oriented. The last shooting that we had in Denver related to a backyard incident was the shooting and killing of one 16-year-old and the wounding of another 16-year-old paralyzed from the waist down. Now, what they did wrong is they went into the backyard being curious about what marijuana plants look like. This individual homeowner was on the 2nd floor and shot with a rifle from the 2nd story, killing one 16-year-old and wounding the second. This was his second offense, and I suspect he'll be imprisoned for the rest of his life. Have you prepared to expand prevention and treatment services, which is another issue that we think is important? Now, I have 5 kids, had 5 kids. I lost a daughter at 2.5, and I lost a son at 49. And I said 2.5. I have a son that's with me today that's an accountant and a real estate agent and has his own business. My daughter is the first elected clerk and recorder in the city of Denver and now works for Mayor Hancock, because I couldn't believe she didn't like being elected. But I've been elected more than 12 years as mayor and 7 years in the legislature. My wife was elected 13 years in the legislature. And she had the nerve to be the top vote getter and then say she didn't like politics. Something wrong with that story. We still haven't figured that out. And her brother's been trying to work on her as I have. Now, I have another son. This son has a different story. This son developed an appetite for marijuana when he was quite young. For him, it was an entry-level drug. Matter of fact, he shared with me that this is eventually going to pass the country and I should reduce my opposition to marijuana because it's eventually going to pass. And so I said, well, maybe I'm looking at this too narrowly from more of an academic point of view as opposed to listening to from a parental point of view from someone that has actually been addicted to drugs. And for about a day, he had me convinced that we shouldn't be as forceful in opposition as some of us are. Now, I say the half because the last time I contacted him, he was living in Las Vegas, homeless, in a truck. He's a veteran. He served in Panama and served in Korea. Some people that get addicted to drugs at early ages have difficulty in transference, and then they go on to more stronger drugs. Not everybody, some people. But I've watched his life dissipate, both financially as well as physically. He should be about my height, minus the 30 pounds I shouldn't have. But he could use those 30 pounds. But he's a different person. He's a different person intellectually. And I've seen firsthand what drugs can do and how it can affect one's mental capacity and one's mental capacity to sustain themselves. To young people, I often say the following, which they don't realize, is that the best time for you to protect your reputation is before you have one to lose. So often we try to protect reputations after we've got one. They need to protect it before they have one. And so what I'm here today to do is to suggest to you that for those of you in the business community that have taken the position of opposing this amendment and voting no is the proper thing to do, because I think you can win. There are those that will tell you that you can't. There are those that will tell you that young people are for it, and young people are. Many young people are. Young people are for a lot of things that you as parents probably wouldn't agree with. Because I think you set some different standards and different rules, and normally, a lot of times you haven't had the experience to determine what's good and bad, and everything doesn't have to be done by trial and error. And so I would suggest to you that you're on the right track. I think you can follow Arizona. Our population is increased in Colorado to such a degree that, I used to love that song by John Denver, Rocky Mountain High. Now it has a kind of a different connotation. I never thought of that when I was asking for it to become the state song for Colorado, second state song. And so when we say we're mile high, if you've been to Breckenridge, you've seen it's pretty open. We're a mile above sea level, but we're a mile above sea level in many, many ways. And some of those ways I wish we weren't. I don't think we're as great a city and a state as we were, which is one of what the governor was suggesting in Arizona, is let Colorado be first and see how it works. Has the city fallen off the planet? No. Do you see junkies walking around everywhere? No. Are there issues with long-term physical ailments that are being studied by physicians in clinical settings? The answer is yes. And some of the data is still out. And I'll just close with this one because I know I ran over time. I'm also Baptist, and that's a problem with Baptists. We tend to talk long. You should have got a Methodist there much shorter. Or Episcopalian. Yeah, they're real direct. What cops will do, and my brother's a sergeant on DPD, if they stop you, it's easy to do an alcohol test right there. They don't have to do a drug test to determine the amount of marijuana you have in your system. So if they have a choice, they're going to do alcohol. They're not going to do marijuana. That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have marijuana in your system. It just means that they're not checking it.